Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all having an incredible day today. Today we're going to be talking about another Mystery Monday case, and I've researched a lot of cases over the last 4 years of doing Mystery Mondays, and even before that I would watch documentaries and look into cases because it's just always been something that I'm interested in. And out of all those cases, today's case is the craziest one I've ever looked into. Like, you guys are gonna be shook. It was just blowing my mind when I was looking into it because I don't even have any words, honestly. Like, it is just totally ridiculous. Before we get into it, I just want to thank today's sponsor, Casetify. I'm obsessed with Casetify. We know this already. I just think their cases are so cute. This is my absolute favorite one. I'm sure you guys have seen it a million times on here and on my Instagram because it's literally like attached to my phone. I never take it off because it just goes with everything. It makes my mirror selfies so cute and it always matches my outfit. You could customize this as well. You can customize Casetify cases, and honestly they have a million different cases. I swear there's something for everybody. This mirror case is also one of my absolute favorites. I think it looks really cute, but golly gosh, the mirror is amazing. I always take this case out when I'm going to dinner or going to a bar or just going out at night because if I need to touch up my lipstick or I need to touch up my powder, this mirror case, it's incredible. I don't even need to go to the bathroom. On top of being cute cases though, they also are really protective, which is perfect if you're clumsy like me. Like literally every time we go into a store and I pick something up, Kerry will be like, okay, be careful. He doesn't trust me to touch nice things in stores because, I mean, he has good reason. But these cases have military grade drop protection, which saves me from getting my phone fixed every couple of months. They are drop proof for up to 6.6 feet, and despite being so protective, they're not bulky at all like a lot of other protective cases. The cases also have antimicrobial coating, which gets rid of 99% of bacteria, and they're also partially made of recycled plastic, which is just amazing. So if you guys are interested in picking up a new case or you're in need of a new one, you can get a cheeky 15% off if you go to casetify.com/Bella. I will leave all of the information for that in the description down below. And speaking of cases, let's go ahead and get into today's Mystery Monday case. On the morning of the 10th of September in 1999, Girly Hossencofft didn't show up for work at the Bank of America in uptown Albuquerque. One of Girly's closest friends, Ernie Johnson, had been calling the bank all morning to see if anyone had seen or heard from her if she'd shown up for her shift because she couldn't get a hold of her, and they spoke every single night, Girly and Ernie. So the night before, Ernie called Girly as she did every single night. Girly didn't answer. She called multiple times, couldn't get a hold of her. The next morning she tried again and still couldn't get a hold of her, so she was just freaking out. After speaking with Ernie, Girly's boss, Kathy Szymanski, tries calling Girly's home phone, but it rings out and there's no answer. She tries calling her cell phone, but the same thing happens and Girly doesn't answer. So by 8:10 a.m., just 10 minutes after Girly was supposed to start her shift, one of her co-workers named Jesse Grove decided to go to her apartment and see what was going on. While he's on his way there at 8:15 a.m., Girly's boss, Kathy, decides to call 911 to report her missing. Obviously, by this point, Girly's only 15 minutes late for work, so the 911 operator is like, yeah, look, not a lot we can do. You're just gonna have to call Albuquerque's police department's non-emergency number. So she calls Albuquerque Police Department's non-emergency number, and you know, again, they're not really interested because Girly has been missing for not even 30 minutes at this point. But after Kathy calls them 4 times, they finally agree to go and do a welfare check and check out Girly's apartment. Now, I know you guys probably thinking the same thing as the police at this point, like she's 15 minutes late for work and they're calling 911, like relax, it's a bit dramatic. But not only is Girly like a model employee, she's never ever late for work, she never misses a shift for work, she's always the first one to show up. But she had actually moved to Uptown in January of that year after leaving her crazy and abusive husband, who she didn't want to find out her address, like so much so that she didn't even tell her closest friend, Ernie Johnson, her new address. She also told her co-workers and her friends, like, if I'm ever late for work, call the police because he's done something to me. So when Kathy called police, she was telling them, you know, like she's really scared of her ex-husband, everybody at work knows, and that's why we need you to do a welfare check, which is why they eventually, after 4 calls, agreed to do a welfare check and go and check out her apartment. So let's take it back a little bit so I can tell you about Girly and the situation so you can kind of understand why everybody was panicking. And honestly, make sure to pay attention, buckle up, strap in, because it is an absolute roller coaster. It is such a crazy case, and it's a little all over the place, so I'll try my best to make it as least confusing as possible. Girly Hossencofft was born on the 27th of August in 1963 in Malaysia to father Chu Ching Kien and mother Chin Gyok Wan, and she had two siblings, a sister named June Chu and a brother named Andrew Chu. When she was 21 years old, she got a job as a marketing rep at the Hong Kong Bank in Penang, and she became really close friends with one of her co-workers named Susan. In 1989, Susan and Girly decided to take a trip to the US, and it ended up becoming an annual trip. They went back every single year because they just loved it so much. On one of their trips to the US in the early 90s, Girly met this guy named Diazian Hossencofft. He was actually born Armand Chavez in Houston, Texas on the 5th of March in 1965 to Yolanda and Armando Chavez Sr. When he was around 6 or 8 years old, his parents split up, and he and his siblings, his older sister Susan and two younger half-brothers Enrico and Stanley, were removed from their mother and were living with their father and their stepmother. And by the time he was 16, he'd actually moved out from his dad's place as well because he really didn't like his stepmom. He was described as a really compassionate kid, but when he was in high school, he played a lot of football and he actually had a pretty severe head injury, had to be airlifted to the hospital. He stayed there for 4 days, and everybody just says that after this, he was never really the same. His personality kind of changed. He did still go on to attend college. He went to the College of Notre Dame in San Francisco, and when he was 23 years old, he married his first wife, Rosemary Guerrero, on the 23rd of February in 1986 at the Assemblies of God Church in Gilroy, California. And I think this is kind of where his lies began, because on his marriage certificate, his occupation was listed as a technician for an immunology lab, which was just not true. He was actually just a college student with a part-time job at a hospital. And honestly, he wasn't even doing too hot in college. Like, his grades really weren't the best. He did, however, manage to graduate in December of 1987 with a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry. Soon after the marriage, he and his wife Rosemary had a baby, and things then started to get weird. So he was applying to a bunch of different medical schools. He was getting rejected from every single one. In the late 80s, Rosemary started seeing him taking his own blood, and he also started to use this random name here and there that he had literally just plucked out of his butthole. And then towards the end of the marriage, he made this really weird remark. He basically said, if I ever killed anybody, that no one would ever find the body because I would use chemicals to dissolve it. Anyway, their marriage lasted less than 3 years because Rosemary discovered that he had been cheating on her. She said that during their marriage, he had some pretty bad anger issues, but specifically about 3 things. So he would get really mad if anyone didn't think he was intelligent, if people didn't show him enough respect, and about the fact that he didn't get into med school. Eventually, in July of 1990, he actually was accepted into med school. He was accepted into the University of Utah's College of Medicine. He told his classmates and teachers there that his wife and son had died in a horrible car crash, and that it happened as his wife was driving to pick him up, so he felt really guilty about it, which obviously we know isn't true because Rosemary and their child was still very much alive. His professor was actually a bit sus on the whole story. I don't know why. I guess something in the story just wasn't adding up. So his professor had a look online for any news articles relating to a horrible crash where a mother and their child died, and he found nothing. And then one day his professor was looking through Armand's textbooks because his name was still Armand at this point. I know it's so confusing, there's so many names. Just to clarify, Armand and Diazean, same person. But anyways, going through his textbooks, and he found some letters from his ex-wife Rosemary asking him to come back to California, and they were recent, so obviously the whole story was just untrue. Armand, or Diazean, also started convincing fellow students to allow him to take their blood for I guess some tests he was doing, or said he was doing, and then one day he just dropped out. His professor had no idea why at the time, but as it turns out, he was falsifying his lab results. He actually falsified his letter of recommendation to even get into the class. He also falsified a federal grant application listing himself as married to obtain more funding. And he also took advantage of, lied to, and scammed money from at least 2 women. So of course, when the University of Utah found all of this out, they rescinded his acceptance into their medical school. We're gonna get into this more as the video goes on, but this guy was just a massive con artist. He was a huge conspiracy theorist as well, and he was a big fat liar. And you guys are gonna be shook when I tell you more about him. So Diazian and Girly met at SeaWorld in San Diego in the early 90s when Girly was visiting the US, and after she went back to Malaysia, they wrote to each other as pen pals. Eventually in 1992, Diazian asked Girly to marry him, and she planned to move to the US by the end of that year. Before she moved, Diazian wrote a letter to Girly's parents saying, like, sorry I didn't ask for your blessing and asking Girly to marry me, but I don't care. He introduced himself, said he worked for NASA, which has a National Defense System subdivision called NDS, which is where he worked. He said he was born in Zurich in Switzerland, which is just a weird lie because he was born in Houston. And he also signed the letter off as diazion Hossencofft, which is literally a name that he just plucked out of thin air and decided, yep, that's gonna be my name. And he legally changed his name to that on the 17th of July in 1992. So when he and Girly met and when he and Girly had been writing to each other, he actually hadn't even changed his name yet. But like I said, he was a big fat liar, so he had created this whole fake world that Girly had come to expect. So he was trying to set all of that up before Girly actually arrived. In summer of 1992, before Girly arrived in the US, Diazian moved to a new place in Delmar Ave in Albuquerque. He introduced himself to his neighbors as a scientist. He told them he once had a wife who was severely injured in a horrible car crash and that his 2 young children died in the crash. He was a snake oil salesman, like literally. He claimed to be a geneticist and he sold people these fake cancer treatments. He also sold them like anti-aging serums that were also fake, of course, for thousands of dollars, but we'll get into that a little later on. He told people and his neighbors that he had leukemia and that he was going to die in a few months, and he actually used this to help sell his fake cancer treatments and to scam people of money because he would be like, you know, I have cancer, I'm going to die soon, but there's this treatment that I can get that has 3 phases. The first phase will keep me alive for the next 8 years. Then after that 8 years, I go back for the second phase, and the second phase treatment will keep me alive for another 5 years. And then after those 5 years, I go back for the third phase of the treatment, and that'll keep me alive for like another 2 years. So he would scam people with this in 2 ways. The first being selling his fake cancer treatments. He would go to them and say, I was cured by this, and now I have the cure in my blood, so I can inject my blood into you for this price, and you will also be cured of your cancer. And then the other way he would scam people is he would be like, oh, I'm gonna die soon, the next phase costs $90,000 and I don't have the money, please give me some money. Over the years, people invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into his fake cancer treatments as well as into his fake research projects. Like, he said that he could create humans from petri dishes, and get this right, he said he invented a machine that could successfully map out the entire human genome, and he was on the cusp of making billions of dollars. He said that he had protected his invention by storing it in 5 separate parts in 5 separate universities across America, like they're Horcruxes or something. He said that the financial return for anybody who invested would just be phenomenal. He even had his 70-year-old neighbor Pedro investing some of his savings as well, which is just so sad. Diazean also had a 7-page CV, and in this CV he spoke about the fact that he had numerous academic degrees, awards, and like over 40 medical research papers that he had written. The resume also stated that he worked as a cryogenic laboratory research chemist at Stanford. It had a bunch of typos and misspellings all throughout the CV, and would you have guessed it, but all of the accomplishments in that CV were in fact fake. And honestly, this isn't even everything about this guy. Like, it just gets crazier and crazier. Anyway, on the 28th of December, he went out and bought a $7,500 ring for Girly, and the very next day, she arrived in the US in Albuquerque. And then a couple of days later, on the 8th of January 1993, Girly and Diazean got married, and they lived together in New Mexico in Albuquerque. Girly got a job at the Bank of New Mexico on Montgomery Boulevard pretty soon after she moved there, which is where she met Ernie Johnson, who was one of her closest friends in the US, who I already spoke about. In April of 1993, they were moved to another branch of the bank on Renaissance Boulevard, and this branch had a really high turnover rate. It was just a shitty place to work. There weren't a lot of customers, and generally the workers slacked off a lot. But Girly was a model employee. She was one of their best employees, especially at this specific branch. She was always dressed nicely, had her hair done nicely, she was amazing with customers, she was a hard worker, and Ernie also said she was an extremely happy person and was always laughing. Because there weren't a lot of customers at this branch though, Ernie and Girly spoke a lot. They got really close and they spent like every single Christmas and Thanksgiving together at Ernie's place. In February of 1996, Diazean and Girly moved house not very far away. It was just around the corner on Moon Street. And after they moved, Diazean started going out of town often, like for days at a time, sometimes over a week. He said it was part of his calling, that he was blessed with the incredible skill to save lives. When he got back, he would tell Girly about how he did these 12 to 16-hour life-saving surgeries, mainly on women and children that had been in horrible car crashes. I genuinely don't understand this guy's obsession with women and children dying in horrible car crashes. It's so weird. The two seem to be doing well financially, probably from all of Diazean's scamming, which Girly didn't know about and nobody really knew about at the time. Girly drove a 1995 BMW and he drove a Jaguar, and he would go around telling all of his neighbours, I paid for them in cash, honey. The interior of the house though was pretty modest, but there was this one room in the house that he wouldn't let anyone inside. He kept it locked all the time. Not even Girly was allowed in. It was very, very top secret. He spent a lot of time in that room. He wouldn't tell anybody what was inside, but we'll get to that a little later on. So Diazean and Girly had been trying to get pregnant because Diazean really wanted a child, but unfortunately they found out that Girly was unable to have children. Girly really wasn't interested in adopting, I mean for a number of reasons, but also the fact that her husband had leukemia and all these other illnesses and she didn't know how long she had left with him. So with no immediate hope that they could have children, they decided to get a dog. Not long after they get this dog, Girly shows up at Ernie's house at like 7 in the morning, and immediately as soon as Ernie answers the door, she knows something's wrong. Girly is crying and she tells her that the dog died, that it just randomly started convulsing and shaking and died right in front of her eyes. And honestly, based off how crazy Diazean is, I have no doubt that he had something to do with that. But they got another dog and then somehow that one managed to disappear. It apparently escaped from their backyard. And then one day after that happened, Diazean randomly shows up with a baby, like a literal 3-week-old baby named Dimitri. Girly was shook, obviously, because he just randomly showed up at the house with a baby. There was no talk of adopting, beside the fact that Girly had specifically said she didn't want to adopt. There was no adoption process, nothing. The baby was actually Diazean's that he had with another woman, and the only things he told Girly about this adoption was that the mother was Asian and that he had obtained legal sole custody through a legal adoption, and that was all he ever said about it. But Girly did agree to raise Dimitri as her own. By January of 1998, Girly and Diazean had been married for almost 6 years. And Girly started to suspect that Diazean was talking to a bunch of other women because she would randomly get calls at the home asking about Dimitri, asking for Diazean, claiming to be Diazean's fiance. So one day, Girly decides to go and check out that one room in the house that Diazean doesn't let anybody into, including Girly, his little top secret room, because he had left it unlocked. In the room, she found this 3-page letter from an Albuquerque attorney, which basically revealed to her all of the lies that Diazean had built his life and their marriage on. In this letter, she found out that he had been ordered by the courts to stay away from another woman. She found out his real name was Armand Chavez, that he had like 4 social security numbers, that the FBI had visited him about poisoning a woman, that he wasn't actually a real scientist, and that he had been scamming people of their money. Also in the room, she found romantic papers from other women. She also found this document from 1995 that proved that he was impersonating a doctor and that he'd been giving all of these treatments to other women. So Girly confronted Diazean about what she found in the room about these other women, and he got really, really mad and became physically abusive. On the 17th of January 1998, Diazean flipped out in this like violent rage against Girly because he found out that she had contacted one of his girlfriends to tell her that he was in fact married. He had been drinking and he began pushing her and hitting her in the kitchen of their home. He gripped her in a headlock, and the grip was so tight around her neck that she nearly passed out, and then while he had her in a headlock, he just started punching her in the face. They had a tenant living with them at the time named Shelly Abrams. She was in her bedroom. She came out to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and she saw Diazian punching Girly. So Diazian grabbed Girly by the hair and dragged her into their bedroom, where he pushed her up against a wall. I don't know what happened, but somehow a bookshelf fell over onto Girly. So Shelly immediately calls their neighbor Pedro. If you remember, he was the 70-year-old man who Diazian was scamming. He's 75 years old at this point, and him and Diazian were pretty close. And Shelly tells Pedro that Diazian is gonna kill Girly, so he really needs to come over and help. He comes over to find Diazian holding Girly against the wall by her neck, repeatedly punching her in the face, saying, "You bitch, you liar," and just horrible things. He kept going once Pedro came in the room. He didn't care who saw them, so Pedro threw himself between Girly and Diazian like an absolute legend and told Girly, "Run, just run over to my house." So she ran over there and she called the police from their house. When police arrived, Girly had a blood lip, her left eye was bruised and swollen shut, she had marks around her neck and a big scrape down her left leg. Diazian was immediately arrested and charged with domestic violence, aggravated battery on a household member, and assault on a household member. 7 hours after being arrested, he posted bond and was free to leave, and a year later, the courts would dismiss all 3 charges. On another occasion, on the 24th of January 1999, Diazian and Girly were in bed watching TV when Diazian randomly turns to Girly and goes, "Tomorrow I want you to go and get me a menu from the restaurant at the Hyatt Hotel and make sure you take the freeway." She reluctantly agrees. They watch TV for another few minutes until Diazian gets up, leaves the room, and then a few minutes after that, Girly hears an alarm going off in the garage. So she decides to go and check it out. When she gets to the garage, she notices that Diazian is towards the back of her BMW at the rear tire with some tools, and it looked like he was trying to loosen her tire or something. She makes a comment like, "What are you trying to do? Kill me?" And then he shoves her onto the car bonnet. She does manage to open the garage door, and she manages to squeeze underneath it and run out while it's still open. Diazian is chasing her, but she makes it to her neighbor Pedro's house and his wife, and she's banging on the door, and they let her in and they're like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And she tells them that Diazian is going to kill her. They offered her some water, but she was shaking so much that she couldn't even drink it. She calls the police from their house, and then she sits down to tell them what's going on, and as she's sitting there telling them what's going on, she hears a knock at the door. So immediately she runs to hide. Pedro goes to open the door, and as he comes in, Diazian throws Pedro against the wall and is like, "Where is she? Where's Girly?" They obviously didn't tell her. Diazian tells them that he never wants to see Girly again, and then he left and went home. Later, when the police arrived, they escorted her back to her and Diazian's house to grab all of her stuff. She immediately got a restraining order and went to see a doctor. This is what a court order examination documented her injuries as. They said she had numerous cuts, abrasions, and bruises, and the words "husband tried to kill her" appeared near the top of the medical evaluation. She also began looking for a new apartment that day. She didn't move far away. She moved around 2 kilometers away to the Valley Grande apartment complex, but the complex had a massive fence around the whole thing, and it also had security there every night. And she also got the apartment near the back of the complex because it was more remote and it was harder to find. She hardly told anybody where she lived because she didn't want Diazian to be able to find her. Like I mentioned earlier, she didn't even tell her closest friend Ernie where she lived. She did, however, let her co-worker Jesse, who I mentioned earlier, help her move in. He was a couple years younger than her, but he was very protective of her and kind of acted like her older protective brother. By the 9th of February in 1999, Girly had received her temporary restraining order, and she gave it to her boss Kathy. She also told Kathy and her co-workers about the situation, what was happening, and this is when she told them, "If I ever am late for work, call the police because he's done something to me. And she also told her co-workers about all of his lies and all of these other women that he was seeing, which I'll talk about in just a second. Obviously, she had filed for divorce and she was still fighting to be able to see Dimitri, but by the end of March, she signed papers terminating her right to see Dimitri, which absolutely broke her heart to do, but she was hoping that it would save her life in the end. She also only earned $19,000 a year, but she still agreed to pay $100 a month child support for Dimitri. Despite having a restraining order against Diazian, Girly still lived in fear of him. One time when she left work and went down to her car, she saw that her front windscreen had been smashed in and immediately knew that it was Diazian who had done it. Another time when she was driving home from work, she was stopped at a red light and Diazian just comes out of nowhere and is like yelling and screaming at her. He told her she would be killed and that nobody would find the body. He called the bank regularly and tried to ask to talk to Girly, but like I said, Girly's co-workers knew the situation, so they never transferred the calls. But her co-workers did serve as good witnesses because of this, and so Diazian was actually charged with 3 counts of violating his restraining order, and the trial date was set for the 8th of July in 1999, but for Girly, this just could not come soon enough. Her boss, Kathy, actually ended up temporarily transferring her to a different branch in order to help hide her. So let's talk a little bit about all of this stuff that Diazian was doing behind Girly's back. The other women, the scamming, and all of that other crazy stuff. So in 1988, there was this wealthy woman who had hired somebody to balance her checkbooks and cook her meals at home, a private chef. This person was Armand Chavez, or Diazian, but he hadn't changed his name yet, so he was still going by Armand Chavez. So for 2 years, he had been balancing this woman's checkbooks and cooking her meals, cooking her lunch and dinner. And then in May of 1988, she almost died. Her heart, her liver, and her kidneys were all damaged, and doctors concluded that she had been poisoned with arsenic. Police obviously came to question her, try to get to the bottom of who would have poisoned her, and she told them that Diazian, or Armand at the time, her personal chef, had brought her a meal the night before, and he was acting really funny in like, he kept asking her, have you eaten your vegetables? Make sure you eat your vegetables. Why haven't you eaten your vegetables yet? And she thought they tasted funny, but she didn't really think anything of it until she found out she had been poisoned, obviously. Police found no evidence at the home that anybody had poisoned her. They didn't file charges against anyone and basically said that, well, maybe she did it to herself. In 1993, a 72-year-old wealthy woman put an ad in the Albuquerque Journal saying, "Wealthy woman looking for lover," and through that ad, she met Dr. Diazian Hossencofft. He told her that he was a geneticist who had invented a serum that could cure her breast cancer and could also reverse her aging. He told her that he had taken the original youth serum so that it was now in his blood, so he would need to inject her with his own blood. And over the next 20 months, she paid him $25,000 a month for these treatments. He also told this woman that his daughter had died in a car accident, but that he was going to use a strand of his dead child's hair to recreate her genetically in a lab. And he also said he needed a house to raise his new genetically created daughter in, and so this woman bought him a 2-story house in Albuquerque. And then by 1995, this woman's son finally convinced her to see a real oncologist because the breast she had the cancer in had grown to twice its natural size. And the oncologist basically told her that she had 6 to 18 months to live. Her son was obviously pissed at this guy Diazian because he had been feeding her fake promises, fake treatments, and he'd also been scamming her of all of this money. And so for the last 2 years, while she thought that he was treating her of his cancer, she wasn't getting real treatments. So he became his mother's court-appointed temporary guardian, and he cut Diazian from her life, and he also got a restraining order against Diazian so that he could have no contact with his mother whatsoever. She unfortunately passed away on the 27th of January in 1996 due to complications from her breast cancer. In the summer of 1996, Diazian went to get a haircut at Supercuts in Albuquerque, and his hairdresser, who we'll call Mary, said he had a good sense of humor, he had a good personality, seemed like a nice guy, he was a doctor, and he was also single. Seems like an awesome catch, right? Not long after his first haircut, he came back for another, and by his third haircut, he and Mary went on their first date. Things started off pretty well. He liked to wine and dine her, he liked to compliment her, he was also a doctor, so he could do physicals on her 14-year-old daughter who needed them for like sports or whatever. I mean, it was weird though, because in these physicals, he would just tell her daughter like to take your clothes off, he would look at her, and then he would be like, okay, done, that's the physical done. But quickly Mary started to discuss discover all of these weird things about him. Like, for example, she noticed that 2 to 3 times a day he would inject himself with a needle in his pelvis, his wrist, or his ankle. He told her that it was morphine and that it helped to ease the pain of his leukemia, which he had. Then one day she gets home and her 10 and 12-year-old sons tell her that diazean has taken their blood because he had leukemia, he was dying, and he wanted to see if they were a bone marrow match for him, which is just such a crazy thing to do without consulting her at all. And he would make these weird comments to her, like he would say, you know, I can get rid of you, like I could put acid on your body and you would disappear. She kind of blew it all off until 1997 when a woman came into Supercuts. She looked really scared, she was desperate to speak to her, and she told her that her name was Girly and that she was married to Diazion. She also told Mary that if Diazion found out she was talking to her, that he would kill her. When Mary confronted him, he said that he wasn't married, and he said, you know, who told you? And she said, oh, just some anonymous person called me and told me over the phone. And he said, I bet I know who it was. And that is when he went home and physically abused Girly. There was another woman named Julie McGuire, and she owned the Enchantment Lodge in Aztec, New Mexico. She turned 50 on the 4th of August in 1998, and in summer of that year, she decided to post an ad on a dating service, which Diazean found. He emailed her on the 29th of August and, you know, introduced himself a little bit. Let me read you what he told her. He said he had a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from a Tokyo University, a master's in organometallic chemistry from Stanford University, a master's in genetic engineering from San Francisco's University, and an MD or PhD from Cornell. He said one of his parents was Japanese and the other was German, and that he had a Japanese accent, and he sent her a picture of himself wearing a kimono. He said he was born 2 months premature and said he was born on a Swedish ship. He said he had a level 22 government security. He said he was once married, but that his wife had been killed by a drunk driver, and he felt responsible because she was on her way to the San Francisco hospital where he worked at the time. He said that an ambulance brought his dying wife to him in the emergency room, and that he started operating and trying to save her, but in the end he just couldn't. He also told her that he and his wife had a son together named Dimitri. He was very much alive and he was 2 years old now. He also told her he could manipulate human cells and make people younger. 11 days later, they decided to meet up, and Diazean and Dimitri made the 3-hour drive from Albuquerque to Aztec, where they would stay for 3 days getting to know Julie. While he was there, he told her that Dimitri was one of 12 boys who had been genetically engineered by the NSA. He said that his sperm was used to fertilize the eggs of 12 different women, that all 12 boys were created in a single month, and they were all born at 8 a.m. on the 8th of August in 1996. And he also told her that the name of the experiment was Girly, and that that's why Dimitri was always asking for Girly. He started telling her about aliens, and you know, look, I believe that there are life forms somewhere out there in this ginormous, never-ending universe. There has to be another form of life somewhere. But he said there are good and bad aliens, and that he himself is an alien. He said that she had been visited by aliens, and that good aliens had put a chip in the bridge of her nose, and that meant that she was one of the chosen ones who had to leave the Earth before the bad aliens attacked the planet. And he said that because of that, there would be a time where she would be taken to a space station in Colorado Springs. He also told her about his age reversing serum, and he said, look, I'll give you an incredible deal, I'll give you 90% off, so normally it's $32,000 per injection, but I'll give it to you for $3,200 per injection. You need a couple injections a month for the next 6 years. And God knows why, but she decided that that sounded legit and she was going to go ahead with it. Oh my god, and there was this one time when they were laying in bed and she's like about to drift off to sleep, and she randomly hears him like whispering to her, feel relaxed, feel relaxed, feel relaxed. She looks at him and she's like, what the frick are you doing? And he's like, oh, I thought you were asleep. Haha, oopsies. Like, what the fuck? So he was there for 3 days in that trip, and then he comes back again to visit her in January of 1999, and he says the NSA is trying to kill him and Dimitri. Apparently they found out that he'd been giving her the serum at such a reduced rate, and that it was worth $1.8 million that he'd given her, and they wanted him to pay or he was going to die. But he didn't have the money, of course. He also said they wanted to kill the 12 genetically engineered children because they were growing too powerful and they were developing so quickly that soon they were going to be able to take over the world, so the NSA wanted them dead. He said that he had a plan and that he needed her to get 2 passports for him and Dimitri so that they could flee to China. Sometimes he would leave Dimitri with her and he would tell her, you cannot tell anyone of his location, especially not the police, especially not the social services, because they could be the NSA in disguise. Then randomly, he says the NSA has sentenced him to death and injected him with leukemia. Diazean and Dimitri visited her again on the 1st of May in 1999, and she said that when they got there, Dimitri seemed like he'd been drugged. A few days later, she went to Albuquerque to visit him this time, and when she got there, she had to park at a health clinic a little while away from his house because the NSA was watching his house, of course. So he drives her to the health clinic and he picks her up and drives her back to his house, and this part is just so funny to me. So he starts punching in all of these numbers in this electronic panel that he has in his garage, and he goes, you know, the NSA, they're listening to me, but I know how to scramble their code. But the thing he was punching these numbers into was just the garage door remote. The amount of secondhand embarrassment that I have for this guy. Off the charts. So by this point, she's actually pretty sus on him, but she wants to stick around and make sure that Dimitri's okay because she thinks that something weird is going on. She still did believe that he was a geneticist and a doctor, but she was sus on him about Dimitri and just thought he was a cheater and a liar. So she was only there for the day that time, but she goes back 7 days later for another visit, and when she gets there, in the bathroom, there's blood everywhere. In the bathtub, on the countertop, there's like blood-filled needles everywhere and like blood-soaked gauze everywhere. Diazean had these track marks all up and down his arms, and he said that he'd been extracting his own blood because it was needed for the 12 genetically engineered children or something for some reason. He had been drinking a lot. He started telling her that he'd done all these bad things. He showed her this 30-inch samurai sword that he had and also 3 guns that he had. One night he went on his computer and she didn't have her glasses, so I guess he assumed that she couldn't see what he was doing on the computer. But literally right in front of her, he was talking to 2 other women, and he was offering one of these women this youth serum and offering her the exact same deal that he had offered to Julie as well. You know, 90% off, $3,200 per injection, instead of $32,000. So she left on the 11th of May, and then on the 15th of June, she gets a call from Diazean, and he's like, I'm really sick with my leukemia at the moment. And she's like, okay, no worries. I will come and I will look after Dimitri until you're better. Diazean told her, amazing, you can drive straight to my house this time because the NSA hasn't been around for a while. So she leaves that day and she gets to Diazean's place at around 1:30 a.m. She gets Dimitri, she leaves by 9, and she tells him, you know, wave goodbye to your dad, say goodbye to your dad. And he says no. Outright refuses to say goodbye or even acknowledge his father. And she knew immediately from that something was just so wrong. When she got him home, she found that he had bruises on his temples, which he said was from daddy's punch. His rectum was swollen, which I guess she already knew about because apparently Diazean had told her his rectum was swollen from falling on it, which, I don't know, sounds weird to me anyway. I feel like when you fall on your butt, you don't fall on your butthole. Unless your butt cheeks are like inverted. But then Julie started to notice more and more things. She noticed that his penis was super unclean and that there was a red rash all over it. When Julie gave him a bath, Dimitri was complaining about his sore toes, so she had a look and she found that there was little tiny holes between each toe, like track marks. Julie thought it may have been from Diazean injecting him with some sort of drug to make him go to sleep so that he could leave him unattended. And if you remember one time when Diazean and Dimitri visited Julie, she said that he seemed like he had been drugged. So she decided to call Diazean and confront him about it, and he said that Dimitri had been playing this new game with a push pin and he would just push the pin in between his toes. Like, this guy is just such a liar, right? So she decides to call Aztec's Department of Social Services to report what was going on, and they said because the boy's from Albuquerque, there's nothing they can do except transfer it over to Albuquerque Social Services. She asked one of her friends in local law enforcement to do a background check on Diazean, and she found out he was married to a woman named Girly. He was going through a divorce. He had been charged with domestic violence. He was actually born in Houston, not in Switzerland like he said, and his real name was Aman Chavez, not Diazion Hossencofft. It was just a crazy situation. Like, imagine finding all of this out about a guy you'd been seeing And then one day, Diazian shows up at her house, takes Dimitri back, and that was that for a while. So about a month after all of this happens with Julie, in late July or early August of 1999, he meets a woman named Linda Henning, and she is a very important character in this whole thing. And this is where things really start to get crazy, but I'm actually going to finish part 1 here because if I didn't, this case is so humongous, it would probably be like a 2-hour video. So tomorrow we'll talk about Linda Henning, their relationship, their crazy, ridiculous views. We'll talk about the crime and so much more crazy stuff. So make sure you tune in for part 2 tomorrow. I'll leave the link for it down below when it's uploaded, and hopefully I'll see you guys then. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye guys!